New Year's Eve had always been an oddly lonely affair for me, marked more by the heavy quiet of empty streets than the cheer of fireworks or celebrations. That night was no different. At least, that's what I told myself as I locked up the diner where I worked and stepped into the biting cold. Snowflakes drifted lazily from the sky, but they weren't white. They were black. At first, I thought it was soot, maybe from a distant fire or a nearby factory. But when one of the flakes landed on my glove, it melted like any other snowflake, leaving a dark, wet smear. The sight was enough to make me pause. The streets were deserted, the faint glow of streetlights casting distorted shadows across the ground. Everything was muted, as if the snow itself had swallowed the city's usual hum. My breath puffed out in clouds, mingling with the strange, dark flurries that clung to my coat. I was halfway down the block when I noticed the figure at the corner of an alleyway. They were standing unnaturally still, their silhouette barely distinguishable from the shadows around them. A frayed coat hung from their shoulders, and a hood obscured their face. I hesitated, unsure if I should acknowledge them or keep walking. Before I could decide, the figure moved, just a small shift, but enough to send a chill through me. "You shouldn't be out tonight," they said, their voice raspy and low, like the scrape of gravel. I swallowed, trying to muster a response, but before I could speak, they stepped closer and pressed a piece of paper into my hand. I glanced down instinctively, but when I looked up again, the figure was gone, swallowed by the swirling black snow. The paper was damp, the ink smeared, but I could make out 3 words scrawled across it in jagged, uneven handwriting. "Beware the Watchers." A nervous laugh escaped me. It was probably some prank, a joke to spook anyone unlucky enough to be out on a night like this. But as I continued walking, the streetlights seemed to dim, their glow swallowed by the encroaching darkness. By the time I reached my apartment building, unease had settled deep in my chest. The dark snow continued to fall, thicker now, coating the streets in an oily black sheen. Shadows stretched unnaturally long, their edges sharp and shifting, as though alive. I climbed the stairs to my apartment, grateful for the warmth and safety of my small, familiar space. As I closed the door behind me, I heard a soft creak from the hallway. I turned to see Mrs. Carter, my elderly neighbor, peering out from her doorway. "You saw them, didn't you?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "Saw who?" I asked, my heart beginning to race. "The Watchers," she said, her pale face framed by the dim light of her apartment. "They come with the black snow. Don't look at them too long. They don't like that." Before I could respond, she shut her door, the sound of the lock clicking echoing in the silence. I stood frozen for a moment, her words echoing in my mind. The Watchers. I shook it off, telling myself it was just the ramblings of an old woman, and retreated to my own apartment. But even as I locked the door and drew the curtains, a sense of unease lingered. Outside, the snow fell heavier, the shadows growing darker and more oppressive with each passing moment. The hours dragged on, each one feeling heavier than the last. Midnight was approaching, and with it came an inexplicable tension, as though the very air in my apartment had thickened. I sat by the window, watching the dark snow fall. At first, it was almost mesmerizing, the way the flakes twisted and spiraled in the wind. But then I noticed the figures. They were faint at first, little more than smudges against the backdrop of swirling black. But as the snow fell harder, the shapes became clearer, tall, gaunt figures standing motionless in the street below. I counted 5 of them, their heads tilted upward as if gazing at the sky. Something about their posture seemed wrong, unnatural, like marionettes held up by invisible strings. I squinted, trying to make out their faces, but the shadows obscured them. And then, as if sensing my gaze, one of them moved. It turned its head slowly, almost mechanically, until it was facing me. My breath caught in my throat. Though I couldn't see its eyes, I felt its gaze, heavy and unrelenting, as if it were boring into my soul. I stumbled back from the window, my heart pounding. A cold sweat broke out across my skin, and the air in the room seemed to grow colder. I tried to tell myself it was nothing, just a trick of the light, or my imagination running wild. But deep down I knew better. The phone buzzed on the counter, jolting me out of my thoughts. It was an unknown number. Hesitantly, I picked it up. "Don't open the door," a voice whispered, barely audible over the static. The line went dead before I could respond. A knock echoed through the apartment. It was soft at first, almost polite, but it grew louder, more insistent. I froze, my mind racing. I didn't want to answer, but the knocking didn't stop. I crept to the peephole, my hands trembling. Peering through, I saw nothing, just the dimly lit hallway. But the knocking continued, as if it were coming from somewhere deeper, closer. The sound of footsteps echoed in the stairwell, slow and deliberate. My stomach churned as the reality of my situation sank in. The figures in the street hadn't been a figment of my imagination. They were here. The knocking finally stopped, but the silence it left behind was worse. My heart hammered in the stillness, each beat echoing in my ears. I backed away from the door, my mind racing for answers. The message on the flyer, "Beware the Watchers," flashed through my thoughts. What did it mean? And why did Mrs. Carter seem to know something? I glanced toward her apartment. The hallway was empty now, but the door to her unit hung slightly ajar. A faint sound drifted out, a muffled, irregular thump. Against my better judgment, I stepped out into the hallway. The black snow was falling harder outside, piling against the windows like ash. The fluorescent hallway lights flickered, casting jagged shadows across the walls. As I approached Mrs. Carter's door, the thumping grew louder, accompanied by a wet, scraping noise. "Mrs. Carter," I whispered, hesitating at the threshold. The scraping stopped. Slowly, I pushed the door open. Her apartment was dark, the only light coming from the street lamp outside her window. The furniture was overturned, and black snow was scattered across the floor, melting into dark puddles. I found her in the corner, huddled in a chair, her face buried in her hands. "They're here," she muttered, rocking back and forth. "I told you not to look at them. They don't like it when you look." "Who are they?" I demanded, my voice barely steady. "The Watchers," she said, her voice cracking. "They come when the black snow falls. They feed on fear, and they never leave." Her words sent a shiver down my spine. Before I could respond, a shadow moved behind me. I spun around, but there was nothing there, only the door hanging open to the empty hallway. Then I saw it. One of the Watchers was standing at the end of the corridor, its silhouette barely visible against the flickering light. Its head tilted unnaturally, as if listening. Mrs. Carter let out a strangled cry. "Don't look," she hissed. I turned away, heart pounding, but I could feel its gaze, heavy and unrelenting, like a physical weight pressing against my back. The sound of its footsteps echoed through the hallway, slow, deliberate. I grabbed Mrs. Carter's arm. "We have to go," I said, pulling her to her feet. She resisted at first, but when the footsteps grew louder, she relented. Together, we stumbled into the hallway, avoiding the Watcher's gaze as we made our way toward the stairwell. But the black snow was inside now, coating the floors and walls, absorbing the light. The air grew colder, and the shadows seemed to move on their own, writhing and stretching toward us. By the time we reached the lobby, Mrs. Carter was sobbing. "There's no escaping them," she whispered. "They'll follow us. They always do." Her words filled me with dread, but I refused to give in. There had to be a way to stop this, Clutching the flyer in my pocket, I pulled it out again and flipped it over. The back was covered in faint, smeared writing, barely legible under the dim light. Find the source. Destroy it before dawn. I didn't know what it meant, but it was all I had to go on. The black snow fell heavier as we stepped outside. It blanketed the streets in a thick, unnatural layer that seemed to swallow sound. The watchers were everywhere now, silent, motionless figures scattered across the landscape, their heads tilted skyward. "Where are we going?" Mrs. Carter asked, her voice trembling. I didn't answer. I wasn't sure myself, but something was pulling me toward the edge of town, where the abandoned church loomed against the swirling black sky. As we walked, the watchers began to move. They turned their heads toward us, their faceless stares burning into my skin. Their movements were slow, almost lazy, but deliberate, like predators toying with their prey. "We're not going to make it," Mrs. Carter said, her voice breaking. "We don't have a choice," I replied, gripping her arm tighter. The church was colder inside than the streets, the air thick with the scent of decay. The black snow drifted through the broken windows, piling against the pews and altar. At the center of the room stood an ancient stone pedestal, carved with strange symbols that seemed to pulse with an unnatural light. On the pedestal rested a massive black stone, its surface smooth and cold, yet alive with a faint, rhythmic hum. "This is it," I whispered, my breath visible in the freezing air. Mrs. Carter backed away. "You don't understand," she said. "If you destroy it, they'll come for you. They'll never stop." Her words filled me with dread, but there was no turning back. Grabbing a heavy candelabra from the altar, I raised it above my head and brought it down on the stone with all my strength. The sound was deafening, a high-pitched shriek that pierced through the air, making my ears ring. The stone cracked, black smoke pouring from its fissures as the symbols on the pedestal began to glow brighter. The watchers were inside now, their elongated forms filling the room. They moved faster, more urgently, as if trying to stop me. I swung the candelabra again, and the stone shattered into 1,000 pieces. The watchers let out a collective scream, their forms dissolving into shadows that swirled violently before vanishing into the air. The black snow stopped falling, and the oppressive darkness lifted, replaced by the faint light of dawn. I collapsed to the floor, my body trembling with exhaustion. Mrs. Carter was gone, her absence as abrupt as her earlier warnings. I was alone. As I stumbled back onto the street, the town was eerily silent. The streets were empty, the snow white again, but the sense of unease remained. I returned to my apartment, locking the door behind me. On the table lay another piece of paper, identical to the flyer from before. This time it read, "They will return." Even now, as I sit here writing this, I can feel their presence, lingering just beyond the edge of the light. The snow is falling again, and the flakes look darker this time. The quiet in my apartment was suffocating. The pale morning light filtered through the curtains, but it did nothing to chase away the cold. I sat on the edge of my bed, staring at the crumpled flyer on the table. The words, "They will return," were burned into my mind. Every creak of the building, every distant sound from the street below made my heart leap. My body ached with exhaustion, but sleep wouldn't come. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still watching me, just out of sight. I stood and moved to the window, pulling the curtain back slightly. Outside, the town seemed unchanged, silent, blanketed in fresh white snow. The horrors of the night felt almost like a bad dream, but the shattered fragments of the black stone in the church, the piercing scream of the watchers, and the cryptic warnings from Mrs. Carter were too vivid to dismiss. Then I saw it. A single black snowflake drifted lazily down from the sky, landing on the windowsill. My breath hitched as another followed, and another. Soon the flakes were falling faster, mingling with the pristine white. A heavy knock echoed from the door. I froze, the air leaving my lungs. The knock came again, louder, more insistent. My phone buzzed on the counter, the screen lighting up with an unknown number. Trembling, I picked it up. A distorted voice whispered through the static. "You shouldn't have destroyed it." I dropped the phone, my pulse roaring in my ears. The knocking continued, each thud reverberating through the apartment like a death knell. I forced myself to move, inching toward the door. My shaking hand reached for the peephole, but before I could look, a shadow passed beneath the crack. The lights in the apartment flickered, dimming until only the faint glow of the morning remained. The air turned icy, and the familiar weight of their presence pressed against me. "No," I whispered, backing away from the door. The shadows moved across the walls, pooling in the corners and stretching toward me like grasping hands. My chest tightened as the room seemed to close in, the walls narrowing, the ceiling sinking. In the corner of my eye, I saw them. The Watchers were inside, their gaunt forms emerging from the shadows. They were taller now, their limbs impossibly long, and their faceless heads cocked at unnatural angles. They moved silently, gliding across the room, their presence suffocating. I stumbled back, my legs giving way as I hit the floor. The nearest Watcher loomed over me, its head tilting slowly as if studying me. Though it had no eyes, I felt its gaze, cold and relentless, burrowing into my mind. "No," I croaked, my voice barely audible. "I destroyed it. You're gone. You're supposed to be gone." The Watcher didn't respond, but its head tilted further, an almost curious motion. Then, it reached for me. Its elongated fingers stretched toward my face, and as they drew near, my vision blurred. My body felt heavy, as though something was pulling me into the floor. I tried to move, to fight, but I couldn't. The black snow began to fall inside the room, the flakes swirling around the Watchers and settling on my skin. It burned where it touched, leaving icy trails that numbed my senses. I opened my mouth to scream, but no sound came. And then, just as my vision darkened completely, I heard it, the faintest whisper, distant and guttural. "They never leave." When I woke, I was lying on the floor of my apartment. The room was silent again, the shadows gone. Outside, the snow had stopped falling, and the morning light was stronger, more golden. But the black snowflakes were still there, melted into dark stains on the floorboards. I don't know how long I sat there, staring at the marks, before I finally moved. The flyer was gone, as was any trace of the Watchers. But the sense of unease remained. I packed my things that afternoon and left town, driving as far as I could until nightfall. Yet no matter how far I went, I couldn't shake the feeling that they were still with me, lingering in the corners of my vision, waiting for the snow to fall again. Even now, as I write this in another town, another place, I feel them, watching. And outside my window, the first black snowflake has begun to fall.